Welcome back to the deep dive. We grab the ideas shaping our world, slice right through the jargon, and get to the core of what's really going on.
And today, we are really diving deep into three words that are, well, they're essential, but also incredibly slippery.
The public interest.
Exactly. It's the phrase that gets used to justify everything. Building a new skyscraper, blocking a housing development, you name it.
And if you're a politician, a planner, or even just, someone who cares about your community, you're dealing with this idea all the time.
But as the material we're looking at shows, defining it isn't so much a philosophical game. It's more like a political boxing match.
So we're going to start with a really sharp, pretty recent conflict that just lays the tension bare. We're looking at a UK decision.
Right, the one to grant the first planning permission for fracking, that's hydraulic fracturing,
Yeah.
in 5 years up in North Yorkshire.
And this decision was made by the local county council planning committee.
And here's the fact that should, really stop you in your tracks.
Oh, it's that.
The committee approved the plan, but they didn't, despite receiving thousands of letters of objection. Thousands, from local residents, from environmental groups, and this was compared to only, a few hundred letters of support?
Thousands versus hundreds. I mean, that ratio just screams at a breakdown, doesn't it?
It really does. It feels like a failure of democracy.
Yeah.
Yet the decision was legally ratified, and it was done under the banner of the greater public good.
And this is where that gut feeling kicks in for so many of us. That feeling that these huge decisions are being imposed on us by some higher authority.
An authority that seems to care less about our specific lived reality and more about some abstract national public interest.
So what was happening there?
Well, it's a classic planning conflict. The decision had strong support from the central UK government, which is a big backer of the shale gas industry.
Right.
Their position, which goes back to policies like the 2014 DECC proposal, basically defined the public interest as achieving national energy security.
And stimulating the economy.
Exactly. So the local planning body was completely caught in the middle.
Between, the popular Democratic input on one side?
All those thousands of letters.
And on the other, this national policy framework that gave a huge amount of weight to government-backed development.
Correct. The government had already, in a way, preemptively defined the public interest in terms of economic output.
Which effectively allowed them to sidestep all the local concerns, the worries about environmental impact, noise, seismic activity.
Right. So the core intellectual problem for that committee was, which public are they actually serving?
The local public who voted for them, or the national public whose energy needs they're also supposed to uphold?
It's a huge question.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we don't get the history and the philosophy behind public interest, we can never really critique these decisions properly.
I agree.
Our mission for this deep dive is to understand not just what gets planned, but how we define what's actually good for everyone.
Even for the people who might disagree with the final outcome. And we should probably start by looking at the role of the expert, which takes us right back to the post-war era.
That leads us straight into our first section, the shifting definition of the planner's role. For decades, especially after World War II, that phrase, public interest, it was used as an absolute justification for things.
It was. But it was a justification rooted in a very specific model. A model that's now, largely discredited.
And what do we call that model?
We call it the era of the rational planner. Think of all those grand reconstruction projects, the creation of new towns from scratch.
Okay.
The underlying assumption was that the planner was this expert, someone with objective technical knowledge and real moral clarity.
So the idea was that this planner could stand above the fray, above all the messy, self-serving interests of different groups.
And discern the one true common good, just through sheer skill and reflection.
The planner, as this neutral, almost Olympian custodian of the common good, it sounds very authoritative, very neat.
It does. A little too neat.
So why did that model ultimately fall apart?
It fell apart because reality just proved it was. Well, it was naive. By the mid to late 20th century, critics started realizing that planning decisions are inherently political.
They're not just technical.
Not at all. They involve power relations, who gets what, who benefits, and that idea of a single monolithic common good that everyone benefits from equally.
Yeah.
It was exposed as a myth used mostly to justify centralized control.
And what's really fascinating here is that the sources show the critique didn't just come from one side, it came from two completely different political corners at the same time.
That's right. It was a true pincer movement against this idea of the rational planner.
So who was on the first side?
On one hand, you had the left-leaning critiques. They were advocating for, radical direct democracy and community empowerment.
Okay.
They argued that this top-down, expert-driven planning inherently failed the public because it disempowered the very people whose lives are being shaped
So they wanted to dismantle the authority of the central state.
and put the decision-making power directly into the hands of local affected communities.
And then, on the other side,
You had the rise of neoliberal thought. And their argument was essentially, planning is incapable of meeting the public interest. Full stop.
no nuance there.
Not at all.
Blech.
They argued that the public interest is best served by individual choice and, of course, market efficiency. They saw planning as inefficient, bureaucratic.
Something that just gets in the way.
Exactly. So their solution was to slash the state's role and let sectoral interests, all working through the market, prevail. The market itself becomes the ultimate decider of the public good.
But wait a second. If those market critics were so successful in tearing down the concept, why do we still have urban and regional planning? I mean, why wasn't it just completely abolished?
That's the critical counterpoint, isn't it?
Yeah.
Planning persists because, as the philosopher John Dewey pointed out, every transaction has indirect consequences.
Indirect consequence.
Consequences that the market just can't account for. So if I build a toxic plant next to your farm, the market only measures my profit and your immediate loss in property value.
Right.
It doesn't measure the regional pollution or the long-term health costs that society has to bear. Planning has to regulate those collective consequences.
So that gap, the failure of the market to capture those collective costs and benefits, that's what keeps the idea of public interest alive, no matter how contested it is.
Precisely.
Okay, so we know the rational expert can't define it alone, and we know the market can't be trusted to deliver it. This forces us to define interest itself, which is where it gets, well, really interesting.
It is. Before we can resolve that conflict between the thousands of objectors and the government's policy, we need to understand the two fundamental ways political theory defines the word interest.
And the first definition is the real conceptual bedrock. This is the objective interest, or interest as norm.
Right. This view holds that an interest is defined by an external reference to a shared norm or a universal ethic. It's what a person should choose because it contributes to a recognized common good.
Give me an example.
Think about the collective need for stable infrastructure or clean regional waterways or a functioning justice system. These are objective norms that benefit society, whether or not every single person woke up that morning and consciously wants them.
Okay, so it's structural. It's about necessity.
Yeah.
Now, contrast that with the definition we see playing out most often in modern politics.
And that would be the subjective interest, or interest as want. This is entirely based on individual choice and preference. An interest is just what an individual wants or chooses to pursue.
This is the foundation of utilitarianism, right?
It is. The public good is just the aggregation of the largest number of individual wants. If 51% of people want lower taxes, that becomes the subjective public interest.
Okay, let's use a tangible planning example to really nail this down for everyone listening. Imagine a city needs to build a big regional waste processing facility.
A perfect example. So the city's objective interest, the structural norm, is efficient, sanitary, centralized waste disposal for, say, 2 million citizens.
It's a common good. It's necessary for public health.
Absolutely. But then the subjective interest comes from the 1,000 residents who live near the only suitable site. And they say, I want clean air, I want silence, and I want high property values.
And they definitely do not want that facility in their neighborhood. It's classic NIMBYism, not in my backyard.
Exactly. And the big problem for planning is that our procedures, public consultations, letters of objection, town hall meetings, they're really good at capturing and adding up all those subjective wants.
But they're terrible at shaping policy around the underlying objective norms.
They are. They struggle with that universal ethical necessity that, the city has to put its trash somewhere.
Which is why the sources suggest we need a new kind of process to bridge this gap. And this brings in the concept of deliberative democracy.
Yes. Deliberative democracy is an attempt to escape that subjective trap. It tries to move beyond just counting votes or adding up wants.
It's about discussion.
It's about discussion and communication, focused on reaching a common understanding. The goal isn't just to see who can shout the loudest, but to engage in a reasoned debate.
A debate that actually takes account of those underlying objective values.
And that moves the conversation from I want to what is best for us collectively.
Well, if we're going to define the collective us, we have to define the space where we exist. And that takes us into the philosophy of the public realm.
That's right. If we're defining the public interest, we first have to define the conceptual space where that interest gets defined and protected. This is the core idea of the public sphere, as articulated by Jürgen Habermas.
And Habermas saw the public sphere as this space for rational deliberation, a place where private citizens can gather and critically discuss public authority and social issues.
And crucially, he said this sphere has to be rigorously protected from distortion, from interference by the state and also by private market forces.
So if planning consultations are held behind closed doors, or if the information is biased by corporate interests,
Then the public sphere has been compromised, and the decision will almost certainly fail the test of public legitimacy.
This ties back to some really ancient ideas. The sources mention Aristotle and Thomist philosophy, which viewed the city itself, the spatial collective, as the seeker of the highest good for its citizens.
It's true. The space we inhabit is inherently political, and planning must deal with that crucial spatial dimension of the public interest.
It has to go beyond the simple binary of local versus national.
It does, and this is where the Peak District case study is so illuminating.
The Peak District National Park in England? Why is it such a perfect microcosm of this conflict?
Because its very existence as an institution represents the broader national objective interest. It was set up for landscape protection and conservation, a common good for the whole of the UK.
And that objective is enforced by the National Park Authority.
It is, but inside those park boundaries, people actually live, they work, they need homes. So the authority is constantly having to address intense, conflicting local needs. Housing for young families, economic growth, basic infrastructure for the people who live there. The conflict is just baked right into the system.
So the park is managed through this constant grinding dilemma, pitting two different democratic logics against each other.
That's a great way to put it. You have local politicians and planners responding to the immediate subjective needs of their constituents,
Pitted directly against the National Park Authority.
which is obligated to uphold a national conservation interest. And that often means blocking development,
So just adding up the local wants will always lead to paralysis here.
always. If you only listen to the local residents who want cheap, easy housing, you completely erode the national objective of conservation.
But if you only listen to the national conservationists, you fail the local population who can't afford to live in their own community.
This is where participants need a kind of perspective shift. And that brings us back to that difficult idea of the generalized other.
Right. Hanna Matilla, building on Habermas, suggests that collaborative planning has to encourage participants to assume the viewpoint of this generalized other.
What does that mean in practice? It means you have to consider the commitments that are shared and accepted by the whole society, not just your neighborhood.
So if I'm a local resident in the Peak District fighting against affordable housing construction, assuming the viewpoint of the generalized other requires me to recognize the broader societal commitment to providing homes for low-income workers.
Or to recognize the national commitment to preserving that landscape for future generations who might live 300 miles away.
It forces you to internalize the full scope of the consequences. Your planning commitment shouldn't be transactional, like, I'll support this if I get that.
It should be truly shared, sustainable, across all these different publics.
Okay, moving into our final section, we have to address the ultimate power player in this whole system, the state. The theoretical foundation for the state's role comes from John Dewey again.
And Dewey defined the public as all those affected by the indirect consequences of transactions.
That definition is so powerful. It broadens the scope of who matters in a planning decision way beyond just the immediate property line.
It does. And the state's traditional role is seen as regulating those indirect consequences, stopping one person's market transaction, like building a polluting factory, from damaging everyone else's public good.
But the writer Purcell raises a really necessary critique about how the modern state actually does this.
Yes, Purcell argues that the state's reliance on terms like public sector often leads to the state itself just equating itself with the public interest.
The government becomes the sole representative of the public interest.
Right, regardless of whether that interest was actually deliberated on by the public.
Which brings us full circle to our fracking example at the beginning.
Exactly. The government supports the shale industry, frames that support as serving the national public interest, and then uses that definition to override local objections.
Objections from the people who are dealing with the actual immediate consequences.
This is why Purcell advocates for actively practicing democracy outside the bounds of the state. He urges us to think of new, independent ways to produce a consensus that genuinely comes from public deliberation.
instead of just waiting for the state to tell us what our collective good is.
Precisely.
So after all that, what does this all mean? For you, listening, trying to engage critically with planning decisions, we've gone from a fracking site through centuries of political theory. We have 3 key takeaways we hope you carry forward.
First, the public interest is highly contingent. It's context dependent. It's not some fixed universal rule. It's a concept that is constantly being renegotiated between those objective norms and subjective wants.
So you always have to ask, whose interest is being served here? And based on which definition?
Second, modern planning needs to move far beyond that simplistic model of the rational expert planner. We have to demand inclusive, deliberate action.
Where policy is defined by conversation and transparency.
And by a genuine attempt to understand the underlying values, not just by technical calculations or as simple majority vote.
And third, every time you encounter a planning debate, challenge the assumption about who defines the public realm. The methods we use have to produce decisions that actively work to avoid creating these disproportionate winners and losers.
The true public interest should seek a solution that is understood and accepted across the broadest possible scope of those affected.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought. Go back to Dewey's definition one more time. The public is all those affected by the indirect consequences of a transaction.
If we really truly take that definition seriously, it expands the concept of the public interest far beyond the immediate neighborhood.
It has to include the impacts on climate, on regional supply chains,
On populations that aren't even born yet.
So if that single philosophical commitment, accounting for all indirect consequences, were rigorously applied, how drastically would it reshape the next major decisions about land use, housing, and infrastructure in your own community?
It forces us to define the geographical and even the temporal scope of our responsibility.
Something to mull over. Until next time, keep digging.